excuse my pun, but that Hope is a Candle song is lit. Thank you so much for introducing that and leading us in that. I hope that we sing it throughout Advent, and I think it prepared us for our message really well today. I appreciate that. I have good news. We had a baptism this morning. Yes, at least for the last few weeks leading up to it, the student has wanted to keep it private, so I won't say who it is now, but I couldn't resist sharing with you. It was amazing, and it was freezing. She wanted to do it in the ocean, and I was like, it's December. We have a perfectly functioning hot tub, like just a few steps from my house. But the Pacific Ocean is way cooler. I was wearing a wetsuit, she was not, so she really will remember that invigorating experience. And what a way to start this season of Advent as well. I am super excited to be kicking off a very special series on the women of Advent, where I get to preach alongside my dear friends and gifted preachers, Rachel Collins, Jen Gash, and Eric and Sharita Wilson. So this is going to be really good. Over the next 4 Sundays of Advent, we will be looking at 4 of the 5 women who are mentioned in Jesus' genealogy as it is written in Matthew 1. Those 5 women are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. As a side note, Bathsheba is unfortunately the one who is going to be skipped, which is really sad because her story is incredible and it is important. But we had to cut one of the 5 women because Advent is only 4 weeks. And we decided on Bathsheba because she's only referred to by title and not directly by name. And because, frankly, my mother-in-law, Sarah Barton, already preached the best sermon ever preached on Bathsheba for her Harbor keynote in 2019. None of us wanted to try to be compared to that, and that thing is available on YouTube. So if you want to make sure Bathsheba isn't left out of Advent, be sure to watch Sarah's sermon at some point this month. The title is right there. It's a few years old, but it's still extremely relevant, maybe even more relevant now than it was then. For some of us in this room, when we hear the names of these 5 women, their stories immediately come to mind. For others, all or most of these names might be unfamiliar, and honestly, I think that's great. I hope that we all try to come to these stories this month with fresh eyes, because I believe we will not only finish Advent with a better understanding of these women, but also, if we are willing to learn at their feet, these women of Jesus' ancestry will give us a better and more holistic understanding of our Messiah too. For millennia, scholars have been wrestling with why Matthew chose to include these 5 women in Jesus' genealogy. First of all, why include any women at all? In Luke 3, which also spells out Jesus' genealogy, no women are mentioned, not even Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Luke is known for being very pro-woman. The Old Testament has multiple genealogies too, and all of those revolve around the male lineage as well. That's how it worked in the ancient Near Eastern world. It was a given. So not only did Matthew oddly choose to include women at all, but he also chose very specific women to name. There are other women in the Bible whose names and stories would have been very familiar to Matthew. Famous and prominent women like Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah, all matriarchs of Israel, they are all a part of Jesus' genealogy. Yet they are suspiciously left out. There are many theories out there about why Matthew included these 5 women, but the truth is, we just don't know for sure. Matthew doesn't explain himself, but as we read through Matthew 1, they are among the cast of characters that is preparing us for the birth of God incarnate. For whatever reason, Matthew believed it was important to remind us that God chose each of these 5 women as ancestors of the Messiah. Somehow, these women prepare us for who the Messiah is and the good news that the Messiah brings. So, how does the inclusion of Tamar in Jesus' genealogy prepare us for the coming Messiah? Here's my proposal for us this morning. Tamar prepares us for a Messiah who ushers in righteousness, but not in the way we expect or the way we would even prefer. Righteousness doesn't come from polite people and manicured places. Righteousness doesn't happen when underlings fall into line and people with power are entrusted to do what's right, because power will always preserve itself at the expense of people. Tamar's story teaches us that righteousness is accomplished through the nobodies who understand God's purposes better than those who we might assume have a direct line to God. Tamar's story teaches us that righteousness requires a little bit of rebellion against those who refuse to take responsibility. Tamar's story prepares us for the upside-down righteousness of the Messiah, righteousness that arrives as an infant, not an emperor. Righteousness that hangs out with prostitutes, not politicians. Righteousness that values people, not propriety. My guess is that of all 5 of the women in Jesus' genealogy, Tamar is the least well-known, even among those of us who might be very familiar with the Bible. Besides the mention of her here in Matthew, she only gets 2 other mentions in the Bible. That is it. One is a brief summary of her story in 1 Chronicles 2, which honestly makes Tamar sound pretty bland because it leaves out all those juicy details that Robbie read for us just a few minutes ago. And the main telling of Tamar's story is only 1 chapter in Genesis 38. Of all the women listed in Jesus' genealogy, the Bible gives us the fewest details and the least insight on Tamar. So I am going to spend quite a bit of time retelling her story. If there is nothing else you take away from today besides just knowing and understanding Tamar a little bit better, then that is a win in my book. Now, if you don't trust my retelling, that's okay. I understand. This is a Bible tradition. You can read the specific verses using the slides behind me, but I did my best not only to stick to the story, but to also make more obvious how funny this story is meant to be and some of the subtle connections that we might otherwise find it easy to miss. So I invite you to just listen if you would like. Tech team, you ready to follow me? Randy, my brother, thank you. Get ready for a roller coaster. This story is a doozy, and you all know I am a fast talker. Jacob, one of the patriarchs of Israel, at this point has 11 sons. He will eventually have 12. The 4th eldest is named Judah, who is also one of the ancestors of Jesus and one of the main characters in Tamar's story. Judah and his brothers have just done something very, very bad. They sold their youngest brother, Joseph, who happens to be their father's favorite son, into slavery in Egypt. Now, to give Judah some credit, the plan had been to murder Joseph, and Judah was the one who suggested selling him instead. Also, their father was showing some really blatant favoritism, and Joseph was being a little twerp about it, so it's kind of understandable. Sorry, when you Google Bible clip arts, they're all white. I'm aware that this is not a historically accurate depiction. On the other hand, the reason Judah didn't want to murder Joseph was because he didn't see what he had to gain from it. And then, after selling Joseph, he helped fake his death, which sent their father into a depression that lasted 13 years. So maybe that's why Tamar's in the genealogy, because Judah's kind of the worst. And Matthew wanted us to know that Tamar balances out Judah's genes. I don't know, but probably not, because there are a lot of really awful people in Jesus' ancestry. So anyway. They sell Joseph into slavery, and Judah leaves his family. We don't know why. We rarely, actually, ever get a glimpse into Judah's inner life. But given the context, maybe Judah was feeling some measure of guilt about literally ruining everyone's life. Judah avoids taking responsibility for his actions and instead runs away. He meets a Canaanite woman and has 3 sons with her. I put Judah on the other side because he's so emotionally unavailable. Then the narrative skips forward a couple decades to when Judah finds a wife for his firstborn son. Enter Tamar. At the beginning of Tamar's story, she is demure and obedient. She marries Judah's firstborn, who is so wicked that the Lord puts him to death. There's a lot to unpack there, and we don't have time to speculate on it, but it must have been pretty awful for Tamar to be married to someone so terrible that God saw fit for him to die. As was customary, Judah instructed his second-born son to have a child with Tamar so that his older brother's line could continue. But the younger brother doesn't like the idea of having a child that isn't legally his. But instead of declining to sleep with his sister-in-law because he was uncomfortable with the idea of having a child with her, he instead sleeps with her multiple times and, let's say, finagles the situation to avoid impregnating her. Culturally, she was beholden to her husband's family. So even though he is repeatedly taking advantage of Tamar sexually, she has no power to say no to him and no one to protect her outside of her husband's dysfunctional family. If that sounds pretty messed up to you, then you are in good company because God thought it was so bad that Judah's second son was also put to death. Now, Tamar had no fault in any of this, and what should have happened next was that the youngest son would also try to help Tamar have a child when he came of age. But Judah is afraid. He's afraid that his third son would also die if he was with Tamar. Maybe Judah thought Tamar was a murderer. Maybe he thought she was cursed. Either way, he blamed her. Ironically, it was Judah who raised two sons that were so wicked that God saw fit for them to die. Yet Judah avoids taking responsibility for his actions again and instead wants to hold Tamar accountable for his own offenses. So, offering no words of comfort, he banishes her. We don't know for how long, but for many years, long past the time when Judah's youngest son would have come of age to give Tamar a child. And all those years, Tamar lives in her father's house, her life frozen in time. She is forced to perpetually grieve for a dead husband who was never kind and perpetually wait for a brother-in-law who would never arrive. Then Judah's wife dies, and when he finishes grieving, because unlike Tamar, he has that option, he ends up in Tamar's hometown on sheep business. And demure and obedient Tamar, who has been waiting and hoping and despairing, finally takes matters into her own hands. When Tamar hears that Judah is in town, she takes off the widow's clothing that she is still wearing after all these years and puts on a veil to cover her face so that he doesn't recognize her. It's important to notice here that it doesn't say that Tamar dressed as a prostitute, only that Judah mistook her for one. In fact, when Judah's grandmother Rebekah met her husband Isaac, she veiled herself too, and it was widely understood as a symbol of modesty and faithfulness. But Judah here perceives it as an invitation, just goes to show it doesn't really matter how much skin a woman exposes, does it? So when he sees Tamar sitting there at the gate of Enaim, which, funny enough, means eye-opening, he does not recognize his own daughter-in-law's voice or mannerisms, and he solicits Tamar. Apparently, he feels no qualms with moving on with his life after his wife's death while perpetually withholding any future from both his daughter-in-law and his youngest son. Whether she planned it this way in advance or not, Tamar, who had been taken advantage of for years by this man and his family, now takes advantage of the situation. She asks Judah for collateral for payment and receives some of his personal items. Then she allows him to sleep with her to get pregnant, and immediately, humbly, she goes back to her life as a widow. Judah, who sees no reason to fulfill his obligation to his daughter-in-law, diligently tries to fulfill his obligation to the prostitute that he invented, and when he can't find her, he is afraid of being taken for a fool and laughed at, so he cuts his losses and forgets about it. As Tamar's first trimester comes to a close, Judah hears that Tamar is pregnant, and once again, Judah avoids taking responsibility for his actions, and he again wants to hold Tamar accountable for his own offenses. With no desire to show her grace or even to verify if the information is accurate, Judah responds with haste. He finally has an opportunity to put the Tamar issue behind him, and he orders that she be burned to death. By every standard, this is a harsh demand. Being burned to death is an exceptionally excruciating way to die, and it would not have been a normal punishment for whatever crime Judah thought Tamar committed. It is a disturbing glimpse into Judah's heart. And it is revealed as foolish too, because clever and wily Tamar, she had thought it through. Tamar had made sure to get Judah's personal belongings to prove that he was the father of the baby, or, as it would turn out, the twin babies, one of whom would continue the lineage that ultimately leads to Jesus. And that's how both Tamar and Judah ended up in Jesus' genealogy. Big breath. Thanks, I appreciate it. You guys have no idea how long those slides took. No idea. As a reminder, this is our guiding question for today. How does the inclusion of Tamar in Jesus' genealogy prepare us for the Messiah? I personally don't think we can answer that question without Judah. Whereas Tamar is only mentioned twice in the Bible outside of this story, Judah is one of the names that appears most frequently in Scripture. Judah's is the line of King David and of Christ Jesus. Judah is the tribe of Israel that survives exile. Judah's land is home to Jerusalem, the city of God. Even the name of Jesus' ethnic demographic, the Jews, comes from the name of Judah. If you were to read the New Testament before ever reading the Old Testament, you would expect to go back and find a hero in Judah. But that's not who Judah is at all. Instead, we get a guy who is overcome with jealousy of his youngest brother, shame for his questionable actions, anxiety for his wicked sons, and utter callousness toward his vulnerable and dependent daughter-in-law. Judah is representative of the very center of God's people, while Tamar, she is a nobody. We don't even know for sure who her family is or where she came from, except that she's probably Canaanite. She is a literal nobody. And this nobody has the audacity to show the patriarch of God's chosen people what true righteousness looks like. The last thing Judah says in the story is immediately after he realizes what Tamar has done. Or better, when Judah's eyes are finally opened to what he has done, the justice that he withheld and the righteousness that she forced upon him. When he realizes he is the baby's father, he declares, "She is more righteous than I." Tamar, the nobody, is more righteous than the forefather of the king of Israel, the patriarch of the messianic lineage, the origin of the Jewish people. One of the things I love about the Bible is that as soon as we expect any human in the story to be the hero of the faith, the epitome of virtue, the linchpin of change, we are sorely disappointed. Not one character, not Adam or Eve, not Abraham or Sarah, not Moses or Miriam, not David or Solomon, not Martha or Mary, not Paul or Peter, none of them live up to our hopeful expectations. And Judah is no different. This story, as much as he tried to avoid it, is set up for us to laugh at him. He isn't a charismatic leader lighting the way. He's a secretive fool in desperate need of healing, and the person who reveals the depths of his brokenness to us is a nobody. Of course, this doesn't make Tamar the hero either. She is mentioned so little in the Bible that there's no risk of us accidentally putting her on a pedestal like we might with other characters. We get the tiniest glimpse into her life, and it's a depressing one. She is abused, exploited, betrayed, neglected, threatened, and even in the end, she seems to be pretty much set aside and forgotten. But even though there are a lot of dark elements in this story, and there are, it is meant to be a comedy. Kind of a cringy comedy like The Office or Last Man on Earth, which is just my kind of humor, but a comedy nonetheless. But here's the thing about comedies in the Bible, much like good, smart comedies today. They're not funny just for fun. Comedies are meant to reveal the fundamental idiocy of the things we take for granted, and instead envision a whole new world, a new world that challenges what we value and who we venerate. It is the nobody, not the patriarch, who understands the righteousness that God desires. It is the nobody, not the patriarch, who is courageous enough to bring truth to light. It is Tamar, not Judah, who is clever and wise enough to make things right, despite the obstacles put in her way by the man in the story with all the power. It's funny, and it prepares us for the Messiah. The easiest choice Tamar could have made was to do nothing. The polite thing to do was to accept her fate, submit to male authority, and die in quiet anonymity. She doesn't do that. But she also doesn't set out to take Judah down. She doesn't publicly accuse Judah of wronging her, and she doesn't devise a plan that makes him suffer for his cruelty, even though from my perspective, she would have been kind of justified doing that. Instead, she models what her great-grandson Jesus would later exemplify, the third way. In this story, Tamar is what is called a trickster character. But she's a trickster not because she's deceitful or just likes pranking. She's a trickster because she's an underdog with no other options. She has no safety net outside of her own wit. She's less like the Joker in Batman and more like Captain Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean. As tricksters do in trickster stories, she reverses the positions of strength and weakness. But she doesn't trick Judah to his detriment. His line continues only because of her. In the process of exposing Judah, she gets the justice she deserves, and she rescues her perpetrator in the process. Because God's righteousness ultimately always benefits everyone in the end, even when the path toward righteousness is painful for those who need to fess up and take some responsibility. And that is the beauty of the light of God, isn't it? It's not that the light immediately makes things right, but it exposes everything that needs to be healed. Power loves secrecy in order to preserve itself, no matter what the cost or who gets trampled on the way. But the righteousness of God is transparent. It brings all things to light, even the most inconvenient truths. Judah's admission of guilt at the end of the story, I'm sure, was very painful, especially because the inconvenient woman he had tried to push out the back door was the one who ultimately exposed him. And yet, as painful as it was also his redemption. Ironically, Judah's self-preserving secrecy was killing him, whereas the truth he tried so hard to keep hidden is exactly what made him and God's people whole. When Judah's story picks up again in Genesis 42, we see him and his brothers reconcile with Joseph and with Jacob. And it's in part, at least, thanks to Tamar, this nobody who took initiative and became the matriarch of a nation, a queen among royalty, a mother of the Messiah, even if we sometimes forget about her. Tamar prepares us for a Messiah who ushers in righteousness, but not in the way we would expect or even prefer. The righteousness of God doesn't come from polite people and manicured places. Righteousness does not happen when underlings fall into line and when people with power are entrusted to do what's right, because power will always preserve itself at the expense of people. Tamar's story teaches us that God accomplishes righteousness through the nobodies who have a better grasp on the ways of God than those who project piety. Tamar's story teaches us that righteousness requires a little bit of rebellion against those who refuse to take responsibility. Tamar's story prepares us for the upside-down righteousness of the Messiah, righteousness that values people, not propriety, righteousness that hangs out with prostitutes, not politicians, righteousness that arrives as an infant, not an emperor. We often treat the Christmas story as nice. There's a nice little baby surrounded by a bunch of nice people bringing nice gifts and saying nice things. But Jesus' birth and childhood was not cute. It was scary and violent. It was harrowing. And Jesus' life and ministry were not nice either. That's how he ends up as the actual hero of the entire story of the Bible. Jesus was offensive to the pious. He was threatening to the powerful. The good news Jesus proclaimed was not cute. It was so radical, it was so good that it got him executed. And that's because the Messiah proclaims a new world that has no need for tricksters, because there are no underdogs who need to use cunning to receive justice. A new world in which righteousness prevails to the detriment of power, but to the benefit of all people, including those with the power. Just like Tamar prevails over Judah, and the baby Jesus prevails over King Herod, and the risen Christ prevails over the cold grave, the light of God will always prevail over darkness and secrecy in the end. Don't get me wrong, it's a serious affair. But the righteousness of God so obviously exposes foolishness that we can't help but laugh about it.